McClellan didn't see the airplane, so he drove in the tail and shot it down. And of course, his flight commander was pretty disturbed about that. But that's the way it happened. And little Gabby said, "Well, Captain Mack, I didn't think you saw him." And then on the 16th of January in 1944, that same bunch got in another fight over Sidon, New Guinea, covering a bunch of ships, and they got hit by about 40 or 50 Japanese, and the flight leader was after one of them, and his wingman was Gabby Holder, and he was out to the side, and of course as they chased down, they were on a converging flight path, and Holder started shooting, and these tracers was going by, Captain Goolsby, and finally he had to break off because, well, Holder got the airplane, and when he got home, his captain stood him in the corner and started chewing on him, and he says, "What was the matter with you? Didn't you see me?" And Holder says, "Yes, sir, I was sweating you out." But anyway, Holder has written a couple of stories like that, and they will appear in my book too. I haven't finished it yet. But anyway, that P-40 was a very interesting airplane. But as I became the group commander right at that time, by then I changed all three squadrons to P-38s. Now we have a P-38 here out here that some of you have looked at, and if you haven't, you ought to go see it because it was really a famous airplane out in the South Pacific. And I'll tell you a couple of stories about the P-38. We formed a group over there called the 475th Group, and each of the three squadrons, two squadrons in my group and one squadron in another group, formed a cadre for the three squadrons in this 478th group. So part of that group really belonged to us because our kids went over and helped man it and put some experience in there. And that group shot down, I suspect, 600 or more airplanes in the war. Charlie McDonald, who was in the Hawaiian trip with me to the Hawaiian Islands, became the commander. And Colonel McDonald shot down 27. And one of my 80th squadron, the TAD P-38s, checked out General Lindbergh when he came over to visit us. But General Lindbergh went down and flew with Charlie McDonald. And McDonald took General Lindbergh up on a flight as one of a flight of four, and they got a Japanese cornered, and they let General Lindbergh, who was a civilian, I guess, went in and shot him down and never got much publicity because it was really kind of against the rules. But we later made Lindbergh a general, so it makes it all right. But anyway, Charles Lindbergh taught us a new procedure in cruise control on the P-38. What the tech orders said you'd fly with your manifold pressure at about 30 inches and your RPM at about 2100 RPM. And he said, now pull that RPM back to about 16 or 1400 RPM and put the manifold pressure up to about 35 or 36 inches. And of course that piles up your spark plugs after an hour or so of flight. So you increase the RPM and the power and clean them out and then put it back. And instead of being a 6-hour airplane with drop tanks, we wound up being an 8-hour airplane with drop tanks. So just imagine we increased the range of it 25%. And thanks to General Lindbergh, he helped us do that. Now the P-38s, right after we got the P-38s, I, having little experience in it, my squadron commander, who wound up with 25 victories in the P-38s, General J.T. Robbins, he was a major at the time, or really a captain at the time, and I went over and flew with him on my first combat mission over Hollandia, New Guinea, which is a big Japanese And we flew over the mountains and got on the north side and came back and did a fighter sweep across it. And as we were going across it, I looked in my rear view mirror and I had two Japanese right behind me, a little below me, shooting at me. I could see the smoke from their tracers. And my wingman had pulled off to the side and he did a scissor movement on them. And they broke off the attack and I escaped unharmed on my first mission in the B-38s. And then I later had the next mission. I took all three squadrons now had the same airplane, so we could fly the same missions. I took them on a bombing mission up in support of some Army guys between Sidor and Wewak, New Guinea, and we went in and dropped our bombs for these Army guys. And then we came back down the Markham Valley. I put the 48 P-38s in trail, and we were doing lazy eights coming back down this valley, and over on the left against the mountains was where Major General Enos Whitehead had the advanced headquarters for the 5th Air Force. And as I went over there, I pulled up and went right down to low altitude across General Whitehead's headquarters and pulled up and did a roll. And I watched it. Every one of those kids did the same thing. Each one trying to get a little lower, you know. And when I landed, why, here come a Jeep screaming up to my airplane, and the little sergeant jumped out and he says, Colonel, he said, General Whitehead wants you to call him right now. So I got in the Jeep and we drove to operations, and I got patched through to General Whitehead, and General Whitehead said, Cyclone, are you leading that flight? And I said, yes, sir, in a withering voice. And he said, that was the prettiest sight I have ever seen. But anyway, later on in 1944, why, I got orders to come back to the United States. But right at that time, we'd already taken Hollandia, and that's kind of an interesting landing in Hollandia. We went in there, we bypassed Rabaul and Wewak for the Japanese, and they thought that's where we were going to come. And we bypassed them and went into Hollandia with an amphibious landing, and after 2 days, we had 16 casualties, capturing Wakti and Hollandia Air Base, which was quite a spectacular achievement. Then we went on up to Biak, and we put the 29th Division into Biak and captured 3 aerodromes, and the Japanese cut them off from their beachhead, and they had to fight our way back, and so we put the engineers in a little island called Aoi, and they cut out a runway out of the coral, and I took the first squadron of P-38s up to this little island of Aoi. Now this is right on the equator, very tropical. We landed in there. I'd been on a mission since we'd started out at 4 o'clock in the morning. We'd flown about 7.5 hours up to the Jetman Islands on a fighter sweep and back. And we landed, and the sergeant showed me the new camp he had set up, and I said, Sergeant, I've been up so long, you got a place I could lie down and take a little nap? And he said, just got a new tent set up right here by the edge of the jungle, Colonel. Excuse me. So I went in, and there were 2 cots, one on one side of the tent and one on the other, and that was all. Just bare canvas cots, and I laid down on it, and boom, I was asleep. And when I awakened, sitting on the other cot was Captain Peters, who was my armored officer, and the guy that I had in charge of setting up this new camp, and he had a .45 pointed right at me, and he said, don't move, Colonel. I thought the kid had been over there so long that he had really lost it. And boom! He shot that gun off, and I jumped 2 feet from a prone position. And he shot the head off a 2-step viper that had crawled out of the jungle underneath my cot. We call it a 2-step viper because if it bit you, you took 2 steps and collapsed.
One step is bad.
But anyway, I came back to the States for about 6 months. I wound up with a fighter group down in Greater Louisiana. And exactly 6 months to the day I was sent back over there. And instead of letting me go back to my old group like they promised me, why, they put me out with the Navy, and I went down and participated in an invasion into Borneo. And then I got orders back to the Philippine Islands, and they gave me the 8th Fighter Group back. And so I wound up preparing this group to drop bombs. We wound up chasing the Japanese up the Cagayan Valley and dropping bombs on every day. And then come along about the 1st of August, and I'd sent an advanced echelon. We'd taken Okinawa and a little island called Aishima. The historians will tell you about Ernie Pyle, who was a great newspaper reporter, and he was killed there at Aishima. And that's where my group headquarters was supposed to go to. And while I was awaiting orders at Clarkfield in the Philippine Islands, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. And on the 9th of August, we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. And on the 9th of August, I got orders to move my 75 B-38s to Aishima. We took off, landed at Aishima, and my deputy met me, and he said, General Smith wants to see you right away. And I got in a little light airplane and flew over to Okinawa to the headquarters. And General Smith told me, he said, Cyclone, I want you to load every available airplane you have with napalm and do a low-level, high-speed napalm attack on a town called Kumamoto, which is about 100 miles southeast of Nagasaki on the island of Kyushu in Japan. And so we loaded up took off early the next morning, and I wound up with 62 P-38s, making my first penetration into the islands of Japan. And as we flew up the coast out to sea on the island of Kyushu, I'd planned to go beyond Kumamoto and then turn in and attack from the north going south and recover back at Okinawa. And I got the strongest feeling that I shouldn't do that I really ought to go in from the south to the north. And so just as I approached the coast, I changed the plan. I just turned the whole flight and started in a new direction. And right after I did that, right where I would have been if I hadn't have turned, the sky went black with an aircraft fire, right on altitude, right on time if I'd have continued on course. And as it was, we went in and made our attack. I didn't lose an airplane. We withdrew, and the Japanese surrendered 4 days later. Now my story is that the 2 big bombs got their attention, and the 62 P-38s brought them to the table. And of course I came home from the war, and the first place I headed for was Salt Lake City. I had left a beautiful little brown-eyed girl there who's sitting right over here, and I was a little smarter than most fighter pilots, and had given their girlfriends rings, and then some other guy got home and stole them, because I gave her a new Buick and I kept the pink slip. So we got married and we went to Edgefield, Florida, and I stayed down there testing airplanes for 5 years. As a matter of fact, Marge didn't really like Florida too much because of the crocodiles and the snakes that she had to contend with, and she had a few experiences with them. As a matter of fact, you'll have to excuse the language, but she told me one time, if I owned all of Florida and had a home in hell, I'd sell out and go home. But anyway, while I was there, we had an opportunity to introduce, can't hear? We had an opportunity, the Korean War broke out, and we sent an F-84 group and an F-86 group over over to Korea, and I was ordered to take a group of test people with me over to test those two airplanes under combat conditions. And being a smart boy like I am, the F-86 would fly at .96 Mach and the F-84 at .82 Mach. So I let another guy take care of the F-84s, and I went with the F-86s, and we went up, flew out of a base called Kimpo, which is about 50 miles out of Seoul in South Korea. And if you look on the stars we have on the hull out here, one of them is Glenn Eagleson, who shot down two airplanes with the F-86. But my job was to evaluate those airplanes in combat, and I lived with Bruce Hinton, Glenn Eagleson, and Don Nance, the three squadron commanders. And Bruce Hinton shot down the first F-86 with shot down the first MiG-15 with the F-86. And he now lives down in Las Vegas, and was a member of my fighter wing over in 48th Fighter Wing in England. But then I left, after that I went to Clovis, New Mexico, and while at Clovis, New Mexico, we had a tactical gunnery meet for all fighters in the United States. And we had the gunnery meet at Wendover, Utah, which a lot of you know where Wendover is. And I happened to win that gunnery meet, and that gave me an opportunity to shoot in a worldwide gunnery meet in Clovis, New Mexico. But I went down there, and the guy that run the fighters out of Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas was this same Bruce Hinton that I'd lived with in Korea. And of course, he won the worldwide gunnery meet. My team finished third. And there's absolutely no recognition for third place. And while I was at Clovis, New Mexico, I changed my squadron to F-100s, and then on the 27th day of June, which happened to be the same day that this guy shot the snake underneath my bed in 1944, this is 1957, I landed at night and I broke the nose gear off of this F-100, and we had a barrier at the end of the runway, which when you slid into it, it'd catch on your nose gear, and the cable would come up and catch on your main gear and stop the airplane. But I had no nose gear. I opened my canopy and I slid through that barrier, and it slid up over the nose of the airplane and into the cockpit with me, and tore my left ear off and crushed my jaw several times, gave me a basal skull fracture and 3 broken ribs. And I used to be a handsome cuss. That's my worst airplane crash. I had a couple of them, but that was the worst one I ever had. And then I went to the National War College, and from there I went to the 3rd Air Force. In the 3rd Air Force, I controlled all the fighters in England on our NATO atomic bomb attacks and one thing and another. I did that for 2 years, and then the commander of the 48th Fighter Wing, which was an F-100 wing, got a little heart murmur, and they had to ground him, and I got the wing, and that was the wing my son mentioned about. And we were, I kept 12 airplanes on 15-minute alert with a nuclear bomb and preordained attack patterns against communist country. We'd have been on our second mission before SAC ever dropped their first bombs. But a lot of people didn't know that the fighters were also nuclear carriers. And it's interesting, the way a fighter drops a nuclear bomb is we don't drop them like the aluminum overcast guys do. we come in at low speed and high speed and low altitude. You know, we're talking about over 600 miles an hour, and when you get over the target, that's when you start the system and you pull up in a 4G turn. And as you pull up in a 4G turn, that takes you way over the airplane, way over the target. And as you get beyond vertical, and of course it's set on a computer, the bomb comes off and comes back over, we call it over the shoulder, and you roll out and head the other way, and it takes 2 minutes for the bomb to hit the ground, and by the time it hits, you're 13,000 feet and 26 miles away, and that's our escape pattern, and that's the way we drop nuclear bombs. And while I had this 48 fighter wing, why they gave us an ORI, and after 3 days, Inspector General went to dinner with me that night, and he says, Cyclone, he said, we're going to stay another day. They'd already been there 3 days, and I said, did you find something wrong? And he said, no, but we will. So I talked him into going on a mission with me the next day. I said, you tell your operations officer to tell my operations officer to order me on a mission with you, and you get in the back seat in the F-100, and we'll go fly a mission and drop some bombs and have some fun. He says, fine. So we did that, and it just so happened that I had a rule that I always had a wingman because of the atomic bombs that I had control over to give me a backup radio. And so we taxied out, by air taxi out another airplane with me, and he asked me about it, and I told him that was my rule. That so happened I happened to know who this kid was. He was a kid by the name of Sam Johnson. Sam Johnson used to fly slot for the Thunderbirds. Beautiful pilot, you know, and he could do anything on the wing position, you know. And I said, don't worry about him. When we take off, you'll never see him, but that's my rule. And so that's the way we did it. The other day on television, I heard about Sam Johnson, who's in the House of Representatives and has been from Texas for the last 25 years. And he's proposing a new bill on how to handle Social Security. I've got to write him a letter when I leave here to let him know that I still know where he is. But anyway, Sam Johnson took off, and that's the last we ever saw him. And we went out and we dropped some bombs and did the mission. And when we came back, I got the highest rating they've ever given in the European theater for an ORI. So you have to do a little bit of politicking when you're running an outfit. And I noticed that my time has already expired. And if you want to see these beautiful airplanes, why you can go look at them. And if Mr. Spencer will let you stay here for a little while, I'll try to answer some questions if you want to ask him. Well, yeah.
Earl, can I get one? You mentioned 2 scary events. You told us about the first one. What about that second one?
That's the second one was the snakes thing.
There you go.
I just had a question here about the timing on the Pearl Harbor thing. It so happens that I was living at Pearl City before Pearl Harbor, and a week before Pearl Harbor, on the Monday before Pearl Harbor, we were all moved back on base. And I was living in the officers club, and we were up and on alert at daylight every morning, and we went through an exercise that dispersed our airplanes. And then on Saturday, they called off the alert. We brought all the airplanes back in on the flight line. And then Sunday morning, about 8 o'clock, just a little before 8 o'clock, the Japanese attacked us. And that was the first we'd seen of the Japanese. And we have a wind over there from east to west, generally. And we had a lot of airplanes parked wingtip to wingtip and nose to tail. And they got that bunch set on fire. And the smoke from those airplanes kind of covered up the other airplanes. And that's why I was able to get in and pull some airplanes out of the fire and this type of thing.
You never told that story.
Oh, I never told it?
No.
Oh, I didn't. Well, I've told it now. I was a Wheeler. That was a Wheeler. All of my experiences were at Wheeler, not at Hickam. But we had P-40s and P-36s at Wheeler Field.
Tell them about the trip over to the flight line.
Well, when I lifted up a window, a guy woke me up. I'd been up since 2 o'clock in the morning. We had a little card game. We had a dance Saturday night, and then after that, bunch of us got together and played a little card game, and so I was up until about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and so I hadn't awakened really. And when they woke me and I looked out the window and I saw a Japanese dive bomber go by, and I jumped on into my coveralls and a flight suit and out the door, and I run into another lieutenant named Collier, and he and I jumped into his convertible, drove down the line. We got strafed as we was going down the line, but the guy hadn't seen us quite quick enough, and he shot up the road in front of us, but he didn't hit us. And we had to park the car and run into the hangars and get rid of the airplanes. But if you saw the movie Pearl Harbor with the guys driving down the road into Pearl Harbor, well, you'd almost think they'd heard my story. And that's the way it was with us.
Tell them about being in that region, loading your guns.
Well, I took a P-40, I decided the raid was over with, and I taxied it out to the bunker that we used in our exercise. It was just a earthen bunker that we could park an airplane in. I parked my airplane in there, and then I got a crew chief, and we broke down the armament door and got our guns and cosmoline and all, and put them in the back of my brand new Oldsmobile and drove out there and put those guns in the airplane. And while we were doing that, a Val dive bomber came back over the field. He had been down strafing Eva or somewhere, and tried to shoot us up in the bunker, but I don't think he saw us quite quick enough either, and he was off to the side, but he was very low at about 25 or 30 feet. As he pulled up, why the guy in the rear, the Japanese in the rear, had his gun, but he wasn't shooting, and I could see his teeth, and he was giving me the grin. And, that was about the closest I ever came to one. Well, I had a friend of mine, George Welch, that his squadron was down at Haleiwa, which is down on the beach, and they were at gunnery, and they had guns in their airplanes. They got on there, and Kenny Taylor was with him, and he got 2 airplanes, and George Welch got credit for 4 airplanes. So they got off in time to shoot them down, but I never got off in time to find any Japanese in the air.
Tell them the action you did see that day.
Over Pearl.
Oh, well, when I got airborne, we had a fighter control unit for chapter, and I called fighter control, and if you saw the very first Pearl Harbor, you notice the little sergeants, when the raid starts and they call in the raid, and they turn to the